be soaked, so listen up, cause this hair of the dog. What's real, what ain't? Is this the fog or smog? Cause there's a difference when you breathe it in. So don't let the corporate media take you for a spin. This that morning show, they put you in the know. So I hope that you ready, cause all we do is go, go, go. Yeah, come get your info, you gon' be like, whoa. Hair of the dog, we bout that, ayy. We in the zone, we out here, yeah. Spitting the facts.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hair of the Dog. I'm Andy Kennedy, and it is a delightful Monday morning, hopefully everywhere. It is here. Anyways, we are going to have a great show for you today. We have a special guest, but before we introduce our special guest, I must introduce the lovely and talented Carrie Barber. Good morning, Carrie.
Good morning, Mr. Andy. Happy Monday to you. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in. If this is the first time you're tuning in, welcome. We take people from all across the political spectrum here. We invite your comments, your critiques, all of that sort of thing. So feel free to weigh in the chat. We will respond to it, and everyone across our community will see it and engage with you. That is the entire point of what we do, a community conversation. So with that, yeah, Andy, good weekend? Everything good with you? Trying to get into it.
Yeah, well, it's my entire schedule got messed up with my maintenance job that I decided to do on my trailer that should have happened in the spring, but I just thought, this is easy, and then it took me 18 times as long to do as it, I thought it would. So it kind of got me behind everything, but Deb and I went out on Friday evening and we got our Christmas tree. We got it decorated on the weekend. It's all shiny and bright and sparkly and all that stuff. So it helps. I think Christmas is a wonderful time, especially considering the year that we just had. And I think that Absolutely. Christmas will go a long way to kind of refresh people's spirits, and it's just a kind of a nicer time of year. And what do people complain about at Christmas? It's just they're just too busy. They're running around going crazy, visiting. Don't have to worry about that this year. We can rest and relax and drink too much rum and eggnog and all that good stuff.
Right. And I think this is one of those times where, okay, we all say that we love homemade gifts so much better than store-bought gifts. There's your heart and soul goes into it, and somebody took the time, even if you haven't done arts and crafts for 20 years, this is the year. Make the handmade card, write the heartfelt note. I think that you're right, Andy. This is going to go so much further than a typical year where you just send somebody, gift cards.
Right, exactly. I've already, talked to Grandma and said, you better start now because I want you to knit me a Ferrari.
Good luck on that, Grandma. That should be great.
She says, I can't get red because there wasn't enough thread, so we're going to have to knit it black. I hope that's okay. I know they're hard to clean.
Well, good for her. Everybody should have a Grams like that, hand-knitted. Right. Ferraris. so with that, I think you're right. This is a good time to step back and take a perspective on everything. We have been so caught up in the trees that you have to step back and look at the bigger picture and the forest here, which is why our guest today, I think, is so timely and just a phenomenal resource for everyone as we're transitioning from the Trump administration into the Biden administration, and we're already starting to see hints and echoes of neoliberal policy, and we can't do that. At the same time, we have miles and miles of lines at food pantries, and we all saw the evictions happen in LA and all of these things that are coming down the pike. This really helps set the groundwork on where we are, how we got here, and having a meaningful conversation going forward. So without further ado, I want to introduce our very, very special guest. This is PhD economist, Miss Sherry Weiss. Thank you, Miss Sherry.
Thank you, Kerri. I'm
It's okay. My mom did it too. She would go, Kerri, Kelly, but yeah, totally fine.
I have a similar name, so I should get it right. Anyway, thank you, Kerri. Nice to see you.
So tell us, the people just tuning in, they heard PhD economist. Why should we listen to anything you have to say? What kind of work are you doing, and where is your expertise in all of this?
Well, I have a PhD in economics with a specialty in agricultural and natural resource economics from Iowa State. I taught college for a little while at Hobart and William Smith colleges, and then I have been working in the U.S. government for most of my professional life. And I've done some consulting, but mostly I've been a government economist. Right now, I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In a previous position, I did some work that was related to antitrust, and that's when I really got an interest in this. And even though I'm now working in a completely different area, and so everything I say today is certainly just my opinion or my observations, and not policy of the U.S. government or the USDA in particular. But I've spent a lot of time studying it, and I've just been really intrigued because I realized when I first learned about antitrust how different it was from what I had learned in my high school and college, undergraduate college classes, what was being done with policy. And so I was kind of shocked, and I was trying to understand why it happened, what was going on. And so over the years, and then during the financial crisis, I also became more and more aware of alternative thinking about economics. So that's when I became familiar with modern monetary theory work and more heterodox economics. And so I spent, a lot of time reading that stuff, and sort of also looking at the intersection between economics and law. So, lawyer, but if you want to learn anything about antitrust, it seems like you want to learn a little bit about the law. So anyway.
All right. Well, let me back up just a little bit on something you said. You said that you had gone to college and university and had all of this intensive study and earned your degree, and then came out finding maybe things don't really work that way. How interesting, because we keep hearing that universities are bastions of liberalism. So I'm confused now, Sherry, because you were talking about you didn't discover something like MMT and heterodox economics until after you left. So what happened? What is going on in the universities here? Was it just yours, or is this kind of how all the little baby economists are coming out of college with one way of thinking?
Well, what happened with me is that, I'm old. I'm a boomer, so I graduated from college a long time ago. But when I was doing my undergraduate, this was in the late 1970s, and the influence of John Maynard Keynes was still big. And I did take classes on comparative economic systems. We had a professor from the Ukraine who was there, and this was back at the time when there was still a Soviet Union. And so we learned about Marxism and, other types of centrally kind of planned economies. But I've also loved history. And so I had a history of economic thought class. And so I, kind of learned about some alternative ways of thinking. When I got to graduate school, by the time I got to graduate school, the profession had actually changed, because by then, Keynesianism was just considered dead and in the water. And so really, we had my first class in macro was in was more or less a Keynesian type of class. But from then on, macro was all rational expectations and real business cycle theory and all the things that have since the financial crisis have become recognized as really being fundamentally flawed. But that was what was being taught as macroeconomics back then. So, it was really disappointing for me because I actually really liked macroeconomics. But, once we got into rational expectations and everything, it was just so I guess I had some disillusionment in graduate school, but it was an agricultural economics school, and so it was fairly traditional economics. A lot of the sometimes you see economics described as there's a dichotomy between freshwater and saltwater economists, meaning that economists who live and study on the coasts tend to have a slightly different perspective than economists in the more central part of the country.
Wait. Okay, let me stop you there because that was a really nice way of saying the elitists on the coast tend to think of things that benefit them as opposed to the heartland in the Midwest and the central portions of the country. So how interesting that an agricultural economic study would differ so dramatically from New York and LA and Washington, D.C. So would you say that, not to get too far off on a tangent because we can talk about this for hours, but would you say that that is part and parcel to the policies that we're seeing enacted today, that you have kind of that difference of opinion?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there's too much of an emphasis. I think too much of a difference. But what I would say is that the saltwater economists tend to have more of a positive view about government intervention, and the freshwater economists are more more suspicious of government intervention and regulation. So their solution would always tend to be more focusing on the market, whereas saltwater economists would be more willing to say, have a tax on something or, impose a regulation to address a problem. And a lot of that is really because of the influence of the University of Chicago, which is, it's been extremely influential, and it's been influential all over the world, really, not just in the Midwest. But in the Midwest, I guess there's tendency to in economics to sort of favor that side a little more. And so, yeah, the University of Chicago has Milton Friedman was there, and a bunch of other economists were there that really promoted a free market kind of thinking, and as an alternative to Keynesianism. It was kind of a reaction against Keynesianism. And so they tend to be more anti-regulatory, and in fact a lot of the rational expectations thinking came out of the Midwest. The University of Minnesota was where Thomas Sargent was teaching. And
well, that's actually a really good segue into this series of articles that you wrote when you were talking about free market and all of this sort of thing. So for those who haven't read it, we posted the link and we featured the first in your articles. And I just want to say, I love the way that you wrote these, because the first piece on antitrust is really very basic and introductory, casual conversation, kind of refreshing what we all might have learned in, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth grade, maybe even high school, about the robber barons and our history. It was a really short segment in our history and social studies class, but it's important to understand why those pieces were in. So let's start with the first piece, the antitrust piece, before we get into the other two, because I think to me, while I was reading it, the first piece is your introduction. It's your 101 level course. And then gradually with part 2 and part 3, it got a little more in depth, and it took a little bit more time to go through it and really understand what you were getting at. So let's start with the basics, the antitrust, robber barons. What is all of this about? Isn't the free market king? Antitrust reigns in the free market. How is it supposed to work?
Well, the idea, when you think about the free market, when you first have a class in economics, typically what happens is you're typically taught the supply and demand, and then how the market, how these two sort of forces come together into the market, and usually you're taught that at first the purely competitive model, which makes some assumptions, and these assumptions are that there's a lot of buyers, there's a lot of sellers, and basically there's free flow of information. So it's what we call perfect competition, and everything kind of works out for the best. People pay the prices that they really want to pay, are not taken advantage of. Producers get to cover all their costs, that kind of thing, and a small profit. But that's a very simplistic model, and the point is then there's a springboard from there to more complicated models, and the 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 issue is, and actually for a lot of our history, we really didn't have gigantic companies, and so we really didn't have a need for a lot of corporate regulation or anything like that. A lot of our corporate policy, corporate structures, kind of developed even after the Civil War. So what happened was, over time, you had economies of scale, and of course, various abuses of behavior of some companies and people who own those companies, and these companies came to dominate the market, and so we became the complete opposite of what a free market economy is. They became monopolists, and that's what they sought to do. They sought specifically to dominate the market, take everything, so that they could, eventually either charge as much as they wanted or work in collusion with other firms, and they could do that kind of stuff. And there were no intercommerce regulations. There was no way for a consumer to fight back, or even a fellow producer that was being taken advantage of. And so what we had was, of course, the classical monopolist is John D. Rockefeller, who created Standard Oil, and he really did a lot of dirty tricks to over the years to create this gigantic, massive business, and so he did things like kind of indirectly threaten competitors by saying, well, look, I'll buy you out. If you don't want to buy me out, well, that's okay. You don't need me to. I don't need you to. And then, they play dirty tricks on them. So they basically maybe sabotage them or something like that. Another thing that they did was they formed alliances with railroad companies. And so these alliances allowed them to get good deals on shipping their oil. and then other companies maybe had to pay more, or maybe couldn't even get access to transportation. And so there were a lot of different things that were done like that. And so he became, really like the oil company, became the oil company of the United States. And so there was a lot of anger about that. And it's in the second half of the 1800s, there was it was kind of an opportune time as the country was growing. It was an opportune time for a lot of these forces to kind of come together and create these monopolies in certain industries. And also, another thing is when you look at, say, for instance, railroad and telecommunications, those companies, those industries have odd characteristics compared to, like your average, say, grocery store, little neighborhood grocery store, because these companies, the cheapest way to provide them is in like massive volumes. And so when you have a railroad corporation, competition gets to be problematic, and your per unit costs become much cheaper if you can lay a lot of track and spread the costs over all those miles, including some miles where you don't get as much money, but in other miles that are very very lucrative. And so basically
let me jump in here real quick, because I couldn't help but think of two industries right now today that you are describing inadvertently. First one is our own telecommunication systems with Comcast, AT&T, and I think there are maybe 3 or 4 others that have kind of split up the country in districts, even though they say that they are not price fixing and not, they have kind of this gentleman's agreement of non-compete in certain areas. So that's the first one. And honestly, when we compare the prices and the competition in Europe or in other areas, they're paying like $35 for everything: cell phone, internet at faster speeds, fiber, whereas we're struggling with basics, right? And we're paying 10 times that cost in some areas. Then the other industry is insurance, health insurance in particular. And we know that those companies swear up and down that they're not working together to carve out districts, but you can see it when you see these companies overlaid in a map. You have United Health dominant in one state, or they're the only ones participating, particularly under ACA in one state, whereas the next state has a different company. So it's kind of blowing my mind here, Sherry. I thought that the whole robber baron issue and antitrust, I thought we put that behind us. Are we living in that now? Would you agree with that?
Yes, yes. What happened was, in the late 1800s, we had the Sherman Antitrust Act, and then, but that was it wasn't a very clear statute. And over time, we added to it and reformed it so that basically we covered more and more material, more and more areas of the of industry. And we really kind of came to a point of, I guess maybe you could say, maximum or kind of ideal policy in, I would say, after the New Deal, because the New Deal was very he the Roosevelt administration learned that they learned different ways of kind of getting around some of the problems that the larger industries posed, and Roosevelt had the power of the people behind him. People really liked what he was doing, and there were a lot of unusual circumstances then too. And so what happened was, after World War II, we had a policy of really pretty strict regulation on monopoly, and but what happened was over the years that began to be chipped away, and there were different factors that caused that. But one of the kind of key um, uh, initiating factors is the rise of the University of Chicago and their way of thinking. And in fact, one of the things that happened at the University of Chicago was um, Milton Friedman, who was at that school, he worked together with some lawyers, and they came up with kind of a new field in economics called law and economics, and it was very pro market oriented. And part of that field included addressing the issue of regulating antitrust. And Robert Bork, there were two people that were really influential, Robert Bork and Richard Posner. And both of those men were lawyers that taught law at the University of Chicago. And they basically kind of came up, especially Bork in particular, came up with a kind of a way of justifying cutting back on antitrust regulation. And that was through basically saying that antitrust really should be about minimizing costs to consumers. And so, in a sense, any industry then that has that can benefit from economies of scale is going to have an advantage. And so this way of thinking became extremely influential.
Oh, wait. I hate to keep interrupting you, but you keep saying things and like this light bulb's going off. So it's my enthusiasm, not trying to be rude, but you were talking about how they had positioned the argument in such a way that it was for the good of the consumer, right? So you had FDR, whose power came from the people and their influence over lawmakers. What's the best way to defeat your enemy? Use their best asset against them. And in this case, well, it's the people. So if we position it and frame it that we're actually helping the little guys, not us, then yeah, absolutely. I could see why the public perception turned away and said, oh, this Milton Friedman guy, maybe he's onto something. So for those of you who actually did your homework, we are now deeply into part 2, and I want to move into part 3 because I think we've got a really good foundation for what happened, why it happened, and where we are now. And this is where you split into discussing the 3 different pieces of law. Right. So the basic question, I want to go with John Bonner on this one, who's going to jail? Right. Nobody ever goes to jail. Nobody gets held accountable. But based on what you wrote in your part 3, there is an entire section of law that deals with this that has a little bit more autonomy than we've been led to believe. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Basically, what I talked about in part 3 is that, the overall structure of the government is determined by the Constitution. So, constitutional law is the overriding law of the land. Then the Constitution divides our government into basically 3. As you know from civics. It divides the government into essentially 3 parts: a legislative branch, a judiciary, and the executive branch. And the Constitution gives Congress the legislative authority, and only Congress the legislative authority to pass statutes, which is statutory law. And that's the law that we tend to think about, in our day-to-day. You don't want to steal, because you're violating a statute. You don't want to, aside from the fact that it's also immoral, but there we have these statutes that kind of regulate our behavior and regulate behavior of corporations, various parts of the government. Then we also have the judiciary, and the judiciary, Marbury versus Madison basically claimed that, or set a precedent that the judiciary can act as sort of a check on statutory law. So judicial law, which is actually called case law or common law, more in this country mostly case law. Case law can basically kind of create the I guess you could say establish a more definite framework if they feel that, say, certain statutes are going to pushing the authority of Congress or going against something that's outlined in the Constitution. So if Congress passes a law that the Supreme Court or other even lower courts decide that is unconstitutional, they can reject that law. The third part of the government is the executive branch, and that's the president and all the executive offices under the president. And what happens is Congress passes their statutes. They address a lot of complicated things, but can't typically get into all the details of what it'll mean to actually implement those things. So it has been interpreted, and in fact, President Roosevelt really kind of it was under his administration that this really started to advance rapidly. Congress essentially creates the authority within the executive branch to regulate, to essentially write up more specific regulations in trying to implement or and enforce certain laws. So, for instance, the Clean Water Act, Congress created the Clean Water Act, and it gave the Environmental Protection Agency authority to regulate, to implement the Clean Water Act. So the legislature the statutes that assign and tell what an agency is going to actually implement the laws that's called enabling legislation. And so what happens is then the legislation, after it's passed, the president signs it. It then goes to the enabling agency, and what happens is people in that agency then really create a kind of a set of mini laws, and they're called rules or regulations. And there's a process for that. It's the Administrative Procedures Act determines what these different agencies can and can't do.
So you're talking like, correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking like, okay, so in recent history, Trump's tax cuts for certain, he puts it out there, and this is his presidential decree. He has the power to do that. Obviously, he's done it, as have presidents before him. So this was nothing new. But then once he signs that executive order, it's up to the agency who's over it to really piece out what that means. So whether it's the IRS or EPA, write the guidelines and disseminate that across federal agencies. And then if anybody has any issues, that's when we start to see the court challenges come back through. So it's this entire system that seems to be working pretty well if you're not a fan of regulation, right? So we've seen this not just under Trump, but under several administrations walking back. And this is where your comment about for the people, for free market, that same kind of rhetoric has been used over and over and over again to get us to, I don't know, lull us into complacency, or God help us champion this stuff to the point where we are now with this massive income inequality. We don't have a free market. We have monopolization. small businesses and entrepreneurs are having the hardest time, especially if you look at the last mile in technology with internet connection and everything else. And I think under COVID, not to get on a soapbox here, but under COVID, a lot of this has fallen away. The pretense has fallen away. So I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit. You mentioned MMT. So let's talk about MMT in the framework of where we are now. Sherry, you have all of this wealth of experience, and especially when it comes to agricultural issues. That is the heart of our economy, whether we realize it or not. That is the heart of where we are as a nation. So what would you do now, right? Knowing what you know about antitrust laws and the regulations, and that we have pulled all the teeth away from the regulators, how would you fix this? What advice would you give to the Biden team right now? Because as far as I'm concerned, they've got weeks, not years.
Well, first I have to correct something. There's a difference between an executive order and a law. The statutory law that we think of that's passes through Congress, and the executive only really just approves, or by signing it, or doesn't approve it by vetoing it. Then it goes into the executive branch to go to the enabling agency, which then creates the regulations. And those regulations, the body of those regulations is called administrative law. Now, executive order is a different thing. It is basically a regulation that would be created entirely by the president. So it is not something that the Congress has passed. And so basically, within the Constitution, the president has certain authority to do certain things, because the president is really the head of the executive branch, and so the president can issue an order for the executive branch to maybe engage in certain to do certain things. So, for instance, one thing is that's actually really relevant to all this and environmental issues and stuff is an executive order that requires benefit cost analyses to be done for all economically significant rules that are made. And so and they define economically significant as $100 million or more. And so the president, it was originally Ronald Reagan who pushed this, and Ronald Reagan is the one who actually also pushed the new emphasis on consumer welfare that Bork supported. And how Reagan didn't really do the consumer welfare thing, implement Bork's approach as an executive order. But basically, what he appointed people who were not particularly, that were not interested in pushing antitrust the way it had been before. So a lot of it has to, a lot of what happens in terms of, how things get implemented and how things really get enforced depend on who the president puts in charge of those agencies. And so if you want to have now the president, of course, is the one who sets the policy, but he or she partly sets the policy by determining who is going to be in charge in those positions. And if the president wants someone who is going to be very active in antitrust enforcement, they will appoint somebody who has that kind of background, and they'll be very aggressive. And what has happened over the years is that we still have all those laws on books, but they just haven't been enforced and the way they had been before. Part of the way that it's not enforced is because part of the way that it is not enforced is that they created these regulations that are called merger guidelines. And they basically say, well, this is how the antitrust department, the antitrust group at Department of Justice is going to enforce our this legislation. And over the years, they started adding more. Originally, it was more of a just pure legal kind of thing. But they started adding more and more economics. And as they added more and more economics was becoming more and more free market based. And so now we have merger guidelines that are very supportive of kind of really loose regulation, loose regulation of antitrust. So, yeah, if I was advising the president, I would start with getting some good people in antitrust who are really interested in enforcing what we have now, and also tightening up on the merger guidelines. But there is much more that could be done, and of course, those people could possibly even make recommendations to the president, who could then, say, encourage legislators to introduce legislation that would go further. Right now, what we have is we do see there's a lot of interest in the tech giants right now, and so there's been some hearings, and there's it's kind of tricky because they donate a lot of money to both parties, and so these interests can be represented in ways that I think the average consumer can't, or the average voter.
Well, and to your point, yeah, and not to invoke the ghost of John Bonner again, but he was the one handing out checks on the Senate floor, right? So nothing has fundamentally changed since then. So we're starting to see the list of appointees that in the Biden camp from the transition team and the people that he is asking to, like Janet Yellen for, okay. So that is my opinion. Are you hopeful? Are you seeing anybody with an antitrust bent their focus? Are you seeing any of those names come up under the Biden camp, or are we still SOL?
Yeah, I'm not seeing people that I would like to see. One problem is that, and this is a problem not with antitrust, but with all of government, is that over the years, really since kind of the takeover of the neoliberal way of thinking, is that so many of our regulators they basically go through the revolving door between government and industry. And so they, so a lot of times people will be working for the Department of Justice and then go work for a law firm that does, corporate law. And Amazon, I saw recently, Amazon was they have been actually for a while trying to hire some antitrust economists. So you know what they're gonna do.
So I thought it was interesting because Warren Mosler himself sent a tweet and a screenshot where he had put his own name in the hat for the Biden camp and got we'll call you. Thanks so much for your submission. So
I thought that may be the first time that a billionaire's ever gotten a form letter.
Right. Thank you, but no thank you. So shout out to Warren Mosler himself, MMD. He tried, and he's right at the top of this tweet. He's like, I wash my hands of this, and I hate to see it, but maybe we can still get a Stephanie Kelton or a Sherry. Put your name in the hat and give us some hope there. So
No, I'm not qualified.
I think
Anything
chairman of the
that
Fed
responsibility.
would have a really nice ring to it, right? Or head
Definitely,
of the
definitely.
treasury, or you know.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I'm not a macroeconomist, so I don't think that that I would qualify for something like that. So, but no, I'm just a kind of low level bureaucrat kind of person, and so I don't have that kind of experience or anything like that, and I really wouldn't want to do it. But I do like the idea of a kind of spreading the knowledge that I've gained over the years about some of these things to the average person, because the average person really doesn't, we don't get taught much in about civics anymore in high school, and so a lot of people just don't know a lot of basic things about the way the government functions, and so it would. I like being able to kind of try to explain some of the stuff that I've seen, and looking, within economics, I kind of see a lot of the flaws in a lot of the thinking, the neoliberal thinking. And so for me, I kind of like the idea of just basically kind of sharing the information and hopefully educating people so that they can start to think more about these things. And because what we need strategies to fight these things. And so anyway.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, which is why we were so eager to feature not only your written work, but have you on. So for people who are interested in following you, hearing what you have to say, because you have some really unique insights, especially in your field of work. How do they follow you aside from, when we get permission to reprint your articles?
Well, I've been involved with Beyond the Spectrum, and which works with Progressive Insider, and so I would say go to the Beyond the Spectrum Facebook page is really the simplest. And I'm only halfway through the series. I have three more pieces coming out. The fourth piece is going to talk about how, more detail about how we went from strong regulatory base for antitrust to the current situation. The fifth part is going to be talking about the implications, what has panned out as a result of that, and what we find is increased inequality, increased industry concentration, reduced ability for small businesses to thrive, all kinds of things. And then the final one is going to be on how we might proceed from here on in. I would also recommend there's some really good books coming out that now and have come out in the last couple of years that I don't know these people, and so there's no conflict of interest here or anything. But one is Goliath by Matt Stoller. Really good history of antitrust, and he really gets into a lot of the kind of the nitty gritty of how things developed, and talks about who was kind of fighting for it, and who was working against this, and why those things happened. I mean, what were the social forces that kind of led these changes that occurred. So that's a really good book. I'm right now reading a book by Barry Lynn called Cornered, which is a really great book. That is really comprehensive, and it is a little more recent stuff. Zephyr Teachout has a book out right now. I can't think of the name of it right offhand. So there are some good books that are out there right now, and there are some organizations that are working on this, and of course now I forgot what they are. So I can provide you with links to some of those organizations.
Yeah, that would be great. And we are more than happy to work with your organization. And honestly, we try to do a good job here, Andy, with his important work on macaroni and cheese and making sure that people get the information so that they can make an informed decision. So we so appreciate you taking the time to not only write these pieces, which are brilliant, but to come on and talk about it, because I think these are fundamental building blocks that the average person needs in order to make good decisions, not just once a year on election time, but all the time, because what happens locally, statewide, nationally, all of it has a cascading effect. So thank you so much, Ms. Sherry. Andy, do you have any comments? I have once again dominated the entire conversation. So
That's not a problem. I don't mind. It gives me an hour off.
thanks, Andy.
I just wanted to briefly just talk again. We talked about this on Friday, but since then, our podcast that came out was with Robert Hockett, Cornell law professor and lawyer to the stars, as I like to call him. And Robert is a eternal optimist, right? He'll always see the glass half full as opposed to half empty. So he has a really cool critique about the different people that the Biden administration are considering for different positions, right? And so he does have some interesting things to say about it, including that because of Biden's age and the fact that he's not necessarily thinking about trying to raise money from the different industries for re-election. He's probably pretty close to retirement. A lot of people think that if he makes it to the end of his 4-year term, that he'll probably retire anyways. But, his presidency might turn out to be more of a legacy thing than a, deficit hawk, austerity driven presidency that he's always, been known for his entire career as a neoliberal and a centrist, right? So there is a fair bit of optimism in including even positions for people like Stephanie Kelton in the government and so on and so forth. So it's not cut and dried that the Biden presidency will just be the same old. And, of course, we'll see what happens. I believe that, that if you're going to run a campaign based on the fact that you're not the other guy, then when you get elected, you have to prove why you're not the other guy, right? And I think that means making people whole during a pandemic. And when you do that, you're kind of displaying to everyone that the austerity model for the last 5 decades in the United States is just a crock of hooey, right?
that's putting it politely. Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. So let's wrap it up here. Miss Sherry, thank you so much for all of your time, wisdom, and your phenomenal talent helping people understand this. So will you come back on and talk about some more of this?
Sure. Yeah. This is, I think like what happened with me, I think with a lot of people in this country, we kind of thought things were going along just fine. And then the financial crisis hit. And all of a sudden, you find out that all these terrible things have been kind of going on that your average person hasn't really paid attention to or, hasn't known or, understood the ramifications. And everything kind of came to a head, it seems, after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. And so I think antitrust is one of those things that's been kind of going on under the, under the surface, and but it's had a profound impact, and it's also kind of cumulative with a lot of the other things that have been going on. And so I think it's something that It seems like it's a really boring topic, but I think it's something that is really important and has affected people in many, many ways that they don't really realize until it's pointed out to them.
Very well said. Very well said. And on that note, I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to do all of this. So, Ms. Sherry, thank you. Andy, thank you so much for your time. I hope the rest of your Monday is good. And yeah, look forward to meeting you back here on Wednesday, 10 a.m. Eastern. We will have more great topics. And then on Friday, we have an actual professional comedian who will be joining us. So that'll be wonderful for your Friday vibe. So
unlike the pretend one that you work with now.
Well, you're not exactly professional. Amateur comedian, professional podcaster.
No, I'm more of a, what are you, a comedian type comedian. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So from all of us here at DLF, thank you so much for tuning in. And this has been a Monday Hair of the Dog. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Dog, we bout that, ayy. We in the zone, we out here, yeah. Spitting the facts, how it's supposed to be. Hair of the dog, we keeping it G. Whoa.